Welcome to Ascension of the Chessmen, diving into the esoteric, occult, spiritual, and conspiratorial aspects of life, focused on solutions to the problems we face in our everyday lives. Let us ascend above all differences. Let us be the light in darkness, a breath of fresh air to those who can hardly breathe, and together awaken into greatness. This is Ascension of the Chessmen with your host, Andre Mitty.
Welcome to the Ascension of the Chessmen podcast. I am your host, Andre Mitty. Today's guest is a spiritual seeker, occult researcher, podcast booker, and host of the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, hobbits and fairies, give a warm welcome to Mark Steeves.
Whoa, dude, killer intro. Thank you. That's a warm welcome. I always love that. It's a pleasure to be here, dude. Really a pleasure. I'm excited to get into it. Thanks for having me.
Definitely, brother. Glad to have you here. Again, I just want to say thanks for coming on, brother, and very happy to have you. If you could just tell us a little about yourself and I guess who you are, what you do, and what event in life or society woke you up to realizing maybe there's more to this life than you originally taught or thought.
Great question. Yeah. So like you said, I'm all those things. I have my own podcast called My Family Thinks I'm Crazy, and that's as true as it gets. I couldn't name it any better than that. I just talked to my aunt, as a matter of fact, today. My dad's sister, who was like, "Oh, I listen to your podcast." So I'm like, "Oh God," But yeah, so I do the podcast, and like you said, I'm a spiritual seeker, but really I think, first and foremost, I'm a lover of the natural world. I always have been since I was a kid, and that sparked a lot of the curiosity that pushed me to try to understand the world around me. It started with animals and knowing every single animal, what they looked like, what their name was, what their habitat was, what other animals they interacted with. And as I got older, I became more interested in human affairs, history, military stuff. And then I smoked weed for the first time. And then spirituality really kind of came into focus in a really deep way, in a way that I almost kind of shunned initially, thinking like, oh, that's too good to be true. These religions have an angle. I don't quite know their angle, so I'm just going to be agnostic. So for a large part of my, teenage years, I was agnostic, a little bit nihilistic, and that laid the foundation for weed to kind of come in, wipe the slate clean, and allow me to have all that same curiosity, but towards this new plethora of topics, to investigate, things like, what is our consciousness? Why are we here? Who are we really? Like, what is our true origins? Those are huge questions. I think most people, when they start to open their eyes to reality, really love. So I'm like anyone else here on this awesome podcast tuning in, and yourself, I'm trying to figure this stuff out. And what's come into focus over the past few months is like, whatever I'm doing is working for me, and I think it can work for others, and I want to be able to inspire people to do the same, and find the same success. As minimal as it is for me right now, I can see the potential and where it's going, and it's really exciting. And yeah, it's only, it's only a matter of taking that risk of knowing what your fate is and what your purpose is, and then actually taking action.
100%, brother. Couldn't agree more. So much to unpack there. Like, geez, where do I begin with that? First of all, like, you reminded me of like Terrence McKenna talking about himself growing up. He's like, I was just fascinated by the natural world and, looking at bugs and, so much resonated with, Terrence talking about himself growing up. And
And that
I'm
was a
sure you're
big part
familiar
of
with
it for
Terrence.
me, guys like Terrence McKenna, Carl Sagan, Alan Watts. When I was entering, you know, adulthood, I was smoking pot every day, and I played around with psychedelics here and there. And there was like one or two times where I had done acid by myself and really like listened to Alan Watts and Terrence McKenna lectures. And not that that is like the basis of everything I know, but that had a profound effect on my consciousness in the sense of like undoing the programming that had been programmed into me by society, like Robert
Right.
Anton Wilson's like Undoing Yourself book, or he just wrote the foreword. The book's actually written by Chris Hyatt, but that book was really interesting because it had all these charged meditations in it that was like kind of similar to what Terrence and Alan Watts were talking about, but it facilitated this kind of revolutionary way of thinking for me that I think Terrence McKenna was a huge proponent of and a big figure in this kind of alternative realm. So thank you, man. That's a huge compliment that you're even comparing me to him at all, because he's a big inspiration for me. I appreciate that.
Most definitely, brother. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned like sitting alone with yourself on psychedelics and, playing Terrence McKenna or Alan Watts or Ram Dass or whoever calls out to you, who that may be. And, for me, man, like I did ayahuasca and that shit changed my life. But like, um, it wasn't until I sat with myself on 5 grams in silent darkness, as McKenna always said to go do, that's when it really all came to center for me. And like I had the most like profound, like seamless transition I've ever had from, the sober state to the higher realms, walking around and seeing my Akashic record and all that, and comparing non-duality and duality. And like it tied to my past Aya experiences as well. But like you said, man, I think that's where the pedal meets the metal and the rubber meets the road, is like sitting with yourself, because everyone loves to go trip and go to a concert or, go walk in nature with their buddies or whatever. And there's nothing wrong with that. There really isn't. Used safely and with respect. But sitting with yourself alone, I think that's where the healing can happen. And that's where you can really take a look in the mirror and examine like the deeper aspects of yourself and your triggers and, deep into your subconscious and, just figuring yourself out, I guess.
Mm.
So that really resonated.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the sorry, I don't know if I sound different, but the that was the major impetus for me, because I'd always been more of a antisocial person. I like being social, I loved being social, but it was easier to be antisocial. So psychedelics kind of taught me, what exactly was going on in a way, like with that urge. Why was I going inward? And then from there, I think I found my purpose for socializing, why I liked socializing, being able to share the things that I was so curious about in a way that got other people excited. And instead of being excited about, science and nature and all these things that, had marked my childhood, I became interested in the things that we like to discuss here on this podcast. And the books started coming, and the intuition led from one place to another, experience to experience. And I think when you open yourself up in that way, like you say, you have this breakthrough, you have this inward momentum, the reflection back outward creates this magnetic effect where you start to find people who offer you that next piece. So for me, it was like a process of mentor to mentor to mentor, and different mentors come to you in different forms. Like, one of the first most powerful mentors I've ever had was a homeless guy, who moved to New Haven, Connecticut from Arizona. He wasn't homeless because, he made nothing of himself. He was homeless because he was on a spiritual mission, and he needed to move to this place to do this thing, and made ends meet, and wasn't homeless after some time. But, by all appearances, it's like, oh, why would you go to a park and learn anything from someone like that? But that's the kind of openness you have to have. You have to be willing to accept all human beings the way they are, because the universe, the Akashic, like you said, it speaks to us through these people that come to our lives, sometimes for only moments. I mean, I remember a guy who was by all accounts insane, who would come into the cafe that I worked at. And it was really a bother. Like he was schizophrenic, but some of the things that he taught me just through his own madness were really profound. You know, he gave me this book called the Thanos Syndrome in 2019, and this book is about like sci-fi, you know, vaccines and things like that.
Mm.
So I don't know exactly how awakened he was to what he was doing, but I think the universe does speak to us through these people, even as, you know, crazy as that might sound, that a schizophrenic person predicted anything. But there's truth to that, because every member of the community on the human kind of etheric realm, right? Because we're all in this human community, we all have a role to play. And we all have a purpose, you know, and I think finding your purpose is the first step towards this, you know, and that's maybe that for some people that takes going inward with psychedelics. You know, I don't think it's necessarily predicated on that, but what's most fascinating to me is all around the world you see indigenous cultures taking plant medicines and using them in this ritualistic coming of age type of way, you know. And that was another thing I learned from Amos, you know, my mentor. He was from Arizona. He grew up in a tribe of indigenous people. I don't know the exact name of his tribe, but he's an Indian, you know. That's what he would call himself. And he was there to pray for Geronimo, because Geronimo bones were taken from Oklahoma, Fort Sill, by Prescott Bush, the father of George W. Bush, you know, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush Jr. So this, you know, crime that was taken upon this group of people, the desecration of one of their ancestors and then brought to New Haven. I mean, that was a big wake up for me, you know, to go back to your initial question, like what was your one of your moments that woke you up? Because here was a conspiracy theory I read about online and in books that had proof positive. Like this guy wasn't lying to me. He, you know, sacrificed everything he had back home to come here on this spiritual homage for his ancestors. So that taught me a lot, you know. The things that he taught me were more detailed than that, because I knew him for while I was in community college, you know, and then I dropped out of community college because what I taught myself through that was like, oh, wow, I'm the imperative, I'm the priority, I'm the one who's going to make my life better. So I was like, well, you know, I'm not going to go and waste all my money on some college that's going to put me through the traditional structure. I'm going to take that chance and do it on my own. And sure enough, synchronistically, every job I've had since has given me another skill that's added to what I'm doing now, right? And because I'm starting to recognize that process, it's accelerating. And I think that's kind of why it means so much to me, especially when you tell me that I've inspired you in some way. And that's not to boost my ego up, but that just shows me like, wow, okay, this is working because it's also working for you. That's the universality. That's the beauty of it. And that's what I've always sought out, right? When we're doing research and we see that, oh, all these indigenous cultures are using plant medicine. Why? They're not in communication with each other. At least that's what we think traditionally. Maybe people in Australia didn't know there were people up here in Connecticut using plant medicines in a similar way, you know, and that's the truth. You know, it's universal. So that's where I look for, is like those little signs. But maybe I'm going on a whole twisty, turny explanation here, but I'll pass the ball back to you, bro.
Oh man, that was great. I have plenty to add on to that. Like, yeah, man, just surrendering. You know, you learn that through psychedelics, and you can learn that through breath work or meditation or plenty of forms. Like if you're trying to stay sober, but yeah, just surrendering and accepting like your power and how much love that's inside of you. You know, just sharing that with the world and like chasing your passions, like taking action and doing that. And um, trying to think what else I was going to add on to that. Uh,
Super inspiring. I'm with you, man. And I think that's the beauty of this experience, because this is authentic, right? and people
Right.
are going to learn something or not from this, but that's also part of the synchronistic effect,
Mhm.
because if you found this podcast and you're hearing my voice, there's probably a reason for it. Think about that, average listener who found this podcast, the
Right.
ascension of the chess men.
Most definitely.
And that
Dude,
kind of
it
fits
was
into the whole title of the show, right? Like you were explaining to
yep.
me, we don't want to be pawns at the behest of the matrix. We want to rise above that. We want to ascend and be more than just players in someone else's game. As a matter of fact, let's write the rules to our own game. That's the whole
100%.
experiment I've been taking on lately.
100%, man. And like there's been so many synchronicities just since I started this, cuz like there's always been synchronicities, and like once I started picking up on those years ago, seeing the numerical numbers in the clock, and 1111, 333, whatever numbers that come up throughout the day. Um and then just like seeing, like getting more conscious of it, and then like finally seeing your path unfold in front of you, and it's like, oh, this is what I was missing out on. It's like it's now becoming conscious. Like, what does Carl Jung always say? You make the subconscious conscious. And it's like all that stuff that was hidden in you, you're letting out to share with the world. And it's like, oh my goodness, like so much I want to share, man. Like I was always getting in trouble in school growing up for talking out of turn in class, and it's like I'm finally using that skill, you know?
Right on. Yeah, I definitely had that edge in school. I was like, I like to think I was trying to be a class clown for some time in middle school, but then I realized like, not everybody really gets my sense of humor. There's more like the certain people that I thought I was funny that I gravitated towards. But that's when I started to, really come into my own. And yeah, it was like, this is fun talking about this stuff with people, but to a certain degree, it felt like you have to like give people a big amount of like leeway to catch up with you, because folks like us, Tara and I, we're all like at this level, but not everybody's there, and you got to respect people at where they're at in their journey. And that took a while for me to understand, because I was like clashing with friends and people who didn't agree with me because I saw the world a certain way that they didn't, and I think one of the cool side effects of everything I've been doing lately is like when you start to vibrate with your true purpose and that frequency really becomes the dominant force, the right people start to congregate, and you attract those people, and the people that are in your life, they either rise with you or they gravitate away towards the people that are there for them to learn, the next thing they need at their moment in their journey, right? So that was a big lesson for me, is like, how do we navigate this? Because I do care about teaching people things, but in a non interventional kind of way. And that's why podcasts are so cool, because you find them yourself. I don't like deliver my podcast to your door and expect you to pay me for it. If you
Right.
find it, you listen to it, you like it, you come back for more.
100%, man. Like that's what I love so much about podcasts, is it just caters to the audience. And that's what I always tell people. Like, I hardly listen to music anymore. I just listen to podcasts all day. And it's like I just tell people, like, find one you're interested in. Like, don't listen to what I tell you to listen to. Like, there's plenty of podcasts out there that will cater to your interests and like what you're
Yeah.
passionate about.
And so many people
Plug into
say
that.
like, "Oh, I don't have time to do the things that I enjoy, whether that's art or getting out and riding a bike, or all these things that we do with our hands and our body." But we're entertaining ourselves with TV, where our body's just like laying, sitting, doing nothing, right? But me, I'm done with TV. I've been done with TV for a long time because of podcasting, and because it is a productive way to entertain yourself, because it's not all about serious learning. Like, I'll listen to comedy podcasts a lot,
Right.
because you can get so much stuff done. I mean, whether you're an artist or you like to create things. I used to make a lot of jewelry. So that was like that was a part of my life too. Like, and as a delivery driver, I got paid to listen to podcasts. I chose that job because of that. I was like, listen, I see the value in this as an educational tool. And it was like, whoa, why would I pay for college when I could like get paid to learn and choose the things I'm learning about? And even more, it's more than podcasts. I mean, there's the Joseph Campbell lecture series is like completely, the whole thing is on Spotify. That was a big one for me. I listened to that back when I was a dishwasher at this deli, and that was like even before I found podcasts, as a matter of fact. But yeah, I think there's something to it, man, that's really cool. And I was just talking to Miguel Connor today from Aeon Byte, and he's like, it's the golden age of podcasting. And that means a lot coming from a guy like him. Like, he's been doing this for 15 years, back when it was radio. He was in a radio station. That's how his podcast got off the ground. So, and another person who's a huge influence on me is Michael Wan. And something he said that really spoke to me is like, the currency of the future is content. If we think about that, it's not content in the sense of this frivolous, superficial stuff that we're familiar with now. That's only a byproduct of who's in control of the main flow, right? But more channels are opening up and more things are flowing through those channels. Let's consider what those channels are. Rockfin, podcasting, all these alternatives from the mainstream, because YouTube was that, but now it's becoming more mainstream. Obviously, we don't want to get into the whole censorship topic. I'm not concerned with that because I manifest my reality. I'm not going to go on my podcast and cry and moan about censorship, because I know that that's creating a negative manifestation cycle that I'll have to reap the karmic consequences of. So I'm not concerned with that. I know my podcast is going to be all over the internet and people are going to love it. But that's aside from the fact, is like, my point being, be optimistic, because the channels are flowing, and this content, all it is a human interaction, right? Because you are valuable, I am valuable, we all add value to our environment, our community. That's what we are as beings. We're creators, we create value. And the system robs us of that, it disempowers us from that, and it forces our creative current into other people's channels to create things for other people. And that creates this nihilism and this general feeling of like existential dread that American or the West is kind of cliche, it seems to me. And it's like a joke in media, you see it on TV, they're like almost laughing about it, like, yeah, isn't life so meaningless? But it's not at all. It's never was and never will be. That's just the byproduct of the meaningless mass media mainstream garbage flow. But that's my point. So let's be optimistic, because we have these new flows, these new currents flowing of real, authentic human value, right? People talking about these ideas in an open way. That's what books were for the longest time, because think about it. I mean, before books were commercially viable and able to be printed, there was a control over what people were able to read. And on top of that, most people didn't even learn how to read, right? And then the things that you could read were like religious, right?
Mhm.
These things were segregated from people. Now we're in the golden age where information is so accessible. And if we take that back now at this beautiful opportunity, this nexus point that we have here, we can create a ripple effect that is irreversible, and I think that's what's really happening is people are interested in things that empower them. And naturally, that's an educational, you know, form of entertainment, because we're living in a deprived um, mind sphere. Our mind sphere has been deprived of these things for so long because of the structural artificial matrix that's been imposed on us. And it wasn't just the Industrial Revolution, it goes all the way back to Babylon. That's why occult esoteric studies are so interesting to me, because this force, this parasitic force that is robbing us of our empowerment and our creative capacities has existed as this parasite since the beginning. Almost, I think that's part of school Earth is like, you're here in the third dimension, so watch out for these, you know, parasites, because just like you go to the jungle, there's parasites there that'll grab you and suck the blood from you, you know. So, you know, you got, but you can also find some of the most amazing, unique, rich plants that are like ayahuasca, something you have experienced yourself, you know. So that's the universe. The jungle, that's the universe. There's beauty, there's death,
Oh
everything's
yeah.
there, you know. But just like this beautiful kind of chaos order thing that I've been thinking about lately, and like divination, a good friend of mine asked me, he's like, hey Mark, and he's from Texas, he's like, hey Mark, what's the thing about tarot cards? I don't really, you know, I tried to explain to him like, there's no such thing as randomness, right? Everything has meaning. So even though there's chaos, there's order in that chaos. And that's what kind of divination is in a way. But what I said to him is like, think about the Amazon jungle. Like, you have all of these plants on top of plants on top of plants. Everything's chaotic, looks chaotic. But if you take one of those plants, you just pluck it out and separate it from the whole, you see that it has a Fibonacci golden ratio, you know, geometrical and numerical sequence that determines how it's ordered. So there is order in everything, even something seemingly chaotic as a jungle, you know. And I think that's kind of where we're at in this mental space, is there's this jungle that the empire has grown with all these ideas and, you know, emotional attachments. And if you can get down to the heart, your heart chakra, get down to the root, your root chakra, the root of things, and really start to understand who you are, what you are, why you are, who you are, and where you are. These really the five questions. Why are there five questions and five senses, right? There's only five, right? Isn't it? Why, what, where, how, you know,
Yep.
maybe it's seven, but there's a reason for that. You know, I think everything, you know, maybe now I'm getting into crazy town, but here's the point. You know, it's like, you can make the change right now. It's as easy as recognizing that life is an illusion, so
Mhm.
create the illusion you want to live in.
Right. Yeah, like you said, it's all like a giant paradox, and like it's a beautiful mess. You know what I mean? Like
Mm,
it's a mess, but it's beautiful. And I seen a quote at the beginning of a documentary a few years back, and it was talking about like the amount of plants that are in the Amazon, in the rainforest down in South America, and it's like 25% have been like found as like, you know, this is what they are, this is the species, and only
mm,
4% of those 25% have been studied for their medicinal value in the pharmaceutical system.
mm,
So think of how much like that's just the very tip of the iceberg that
yeah,
they're showing and giving to the public.
yeah,
And i
absolutely.
i feel like that's done purposefully, and you know they're keeping us removed from nature, and that's up to us to bring that back. And I feel like those dominoes are falling, and you know there is a golden age we're living in right now, as far as like, you know, Oregon just legalized mushrooms and other states are following. And you know, I think the sky's the limit, because I think that is our birthright, and that is like um, initiation ritual that we're missing. As far as you know, it's like the Jews have like bar mitzvahs, the coming of age, the ritual of becoming a man, and it's
Mm,
like we don't really have that in our culture, you know. Like I didn't have that growing up. I mean, I grew up Catholic, and it's like we had confirmation, but what do you do in that? Like some the bishop comes and asks you questions, and he's wearing a funky hat. Like I didn't
yeah,
feel
I
any
did
more
the
of a
same
man after
thing.
that day.
I did the same thing. I was confirmed. Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think that we're lacking overall, in this country, or at least the West, for that kind of, yeah, initiation. But that's because secret societies have subjugated it from us. You know, it
Mhm.
used to be for our own good, because people were not, I mean, that's what we're told, people were not capable of, you know, caring for one another, so these powerful ideas were kept from the average person in order to preserve them, so that, you know, people wouldn't fight over them and burn libraries down and things like that. which makes sense to some degree. But I also think
Right.
that we as human beings fell from a more higher state of consciousness. Like our
Oh yeah.
civilization was much grander than it is now because we were in harmony with the planet. I mean, the pyramids themselves have so many mysteries. And to me, from what I've researched and from what a lot of people I resonate with say, it's like these things were devices that did something to benefit the people that live there. But getting a little off track from my point, when we're talking about, human beings, we all have this capacity to know infinite amounts of information. We're connected to that fifth dimensional akasha at all moments. It's just our programming that we forget that, you know. So here we are now, bringing it all into focus, channeling it in the best we can.
Totally, man. Um, so I guess what what got you into podcasting, and was it hard starting out with a day job?
Yeah, it was definitely I mean, got into as in like doing it myself. I had a
Mhm.
podcast, a YouTube type podcast. It wasn't on any RSS feed. Um, and it was just like me and my buddies like smoking weed, and I was talking to them about all these ideas because most of my friends didn't listen to podcasts. So I would get all jazzed and excited about these ideas from listening to all these different podcasts and then want to like talk about it with people. So that was my idea at first, but it really wasn't until Sam had me on his show and asked me to start working for him that I was like, yeah, I got to get, my podcast going again. And I thought of a better name. Hence, my family thinks I'm crazy. Kind of came to me
Love
in
it.
a really interesting moment when my family kind of proved to me that they thought I was crazy when I was like, yeah, I got a job for Sam Tripoli. And they're like, what? What does that mean? Who cares? Like, and I don't
Jeez.
blame them. Like, how are they
Right.
supposed to know? It's not anything in their world. But yeah, it all just kind of came together, man. And like we kind of touched on a lot in this conversation. It's like once you get the ball rolling, and start focusing on what your purpose actually is, things line up, and if you're in the right space, awareness, you recognize the opportunities and you seize them. And it was definitely hard at first, but I quit my job at Amazon because I was like, fuck this. I don't want to work for the Matrix anymore. They're making
Right.
me wear a mask when I'm loading up my van. Then they started taking our temperatures. I was like, this is
Jeez.
bullshit. It's summertime, like of course I'm going to be over 100 degrees. You guys are
Right.
making me sweat my ass off in this van.
Oh yeah.
And then I go and load up my truck and I get my temperature taken, and if I read higher than 100, I got to go home, and I lose a day's pay or whatever the
Jesus.
consequences are. It's just I wasn't gonna have it. Stand for that. I had to stand up for myself, and I stood up for myself in a crazy way. In front of all the other employees, I was like, fuck this, we don't need to wear
Hell yeah.
masks anymore. And like, because I'm listening
Oh
to
yeah.
Tinfoil Hat, I'm listening to
Right.
Grimerica's show, like as I'm
Right.
delivering packages. So I'm just getting fired up and then
Yep.
going, but it was a perfect job. It really did help me get to the place where I'm at now. And yeah, right now it's like, it's a risk, and I'm so happy to take it because it's exciting, and I think
Oh yeah.
that's the secret of all of this is like you got to take risks.
Yep. I it brings me back to my last podcast I just did a few days ago, and I mentioned the Terrence McKenna quote when he's like, people think diving into the abyss is like, so scary going into it, but he says, you know, you dive into the abyss only to realize, it's just a bed of feathers at the bottom. It's like, what were you waiting for? You were so scared. Like, just jump, my man, and
Right on.
watch life
Yeah.
happen. And that's where the magic is just like jumping right into it and like not second guessing yourself. I struggle with that so much in school, like always nervous taking tests. And
Mm.
like, for me, man, like why I look up to you so much is because like you've always been a reader, man, and that's so huge. Like just reading reading books at a very young age and coming up that way versus when I was a kid, man, I was into sports and like I hated reading. I was always like, if it's not something I want to read, I'm not reading it. Or I'd, look up book rags and, you know, cheat on all my pop quizzes on books. Like I was never reading until like the last year or two, man. I really just started diving in. I was like, I really need to start reading.
Mm.
And, I read Secret Teachings of All Ages over the winter this year. And that opened my mind tremendously, because, being in the conspiracy world and stuff, like there's a lot of fear and anxiety that comes with that. And like you just get wrapped up in the darkness in the world and like you forget, like, no, like you carry a light within yourself that you can light anyone else as well. And they can light more people and more people. And it's like a tiny flame lighting a whole room of candles. It's like it changes everything, and it's just that one flame that starts that trend. And there's so much to learn, and you just give me so much hope, man, for where we're going, because you're still a young man and you're heading in the right direction.
Thank you, man. I really, yeah, I appreciate that, and I want to encourage you. It's never too late. Like, and I appreciate that. That's your perspective. But in all honesty, reading isn't easy for me. But
Mhm.
it's the fact that I'm interested in it and I'm driven. Like that separates it for me. I think because I've always the curiosity. Like if you could find something that you're curious about, you can read. You know,
Oh yeah.
like there are times when I don't want to read, but I do because there's something more to find, you know?
Yep.
Like reading doesn't come easy is what I'm saying.
Mhm.
But I appreciate you pointing that out. Sports never came easy for me. So I just kind of
Right.
I hated sports when I was a kid until I found martial arts. And then that was kind of my foray into being physical and learning about my body. And I think that's even more important, having that kind of physical, mental, spiritual control and understanding. Because martial arts taught me how to visualize. And I think that's a big skill that fits into reading. Maybe reading was part of that too. But I think visualization is key to all the other things we're talking about here. When you're able to project your energy and have confidence, it's because you see where your life is going, and then the universe responds appropriately. If you want to see where your life is going, see that it's going in a good direction. Because if you're controlling it, why not make it great, you know, for yourself? Because that's where it starts, yourself. And like I said earlier, the rest will all come together. But if your intention is to read and you set that intention, expect to read more, man, and don't feel
Right.
like you have any limitations, because you don't. The only limitations you
100%.
have are the ones you set for yourself. And I'm not perfect. I have limitations as well, but it's that compunction, change it up, that I taught. Like I felt like you know, like Terrence McKenna, Robert Anton Wilson, these thinkers kind of gave me that reflex of like, oh, change it up, like think about things differently, think outside the box, you know. And so just as easily as you can like be down on yourself, you can have the opposite and be up on yourself. So anytime I'm down on myself, I just flip it around, like, oh, okay, what's the opposite of that feeling? And then how do I get to that feeling? And then
Mhm.
how do I maintain that and be that, become that? And then you are that. And everything
Right.
else kind of grows from there.
And I always wanted to get into martial arts. My my mom always like kept me from it when I was a kid because she thought it was like too dangerous. But I was playing tackle football in fourth grade, like through high school, and then I got into wrestling in seventh grade. And
Oh
I
yeah.
heard you were a wrestler too,
Oh yeah.
and I gotta say, man, like I'm a short, stockier dude, and it's like I always could not stand wrestling tall, skinny dudes. Like you guys would throw the legs in, and you were done, bro. Like getting
Yeah.
choked out.
Yeah, it's funny because I have glasses and contacts that I wear. So I didn't have
Same.
contacts at that age, and I would wrestle like half vision, you know. I could only see like the first 3 feet immediately in front of me. And I think that like helped me focus in more and be able to block
Mhm.
out the crowd and who was watching, because wrestling is one on one, you know. Your
Oh
team
yeah.
is there for you in training, when it comes to the competition, it's you got to
Yep.
fucking get that score, otherwise your team's losing, like every match adds to the win. And when I realized, like, okay, I got to do this for myself and my team, like I think wrestlers, and I can sense this. I mean, I think that's why we're getting along here a lot. I think wrestlers are a different degree, the amount of dedication we put
Hmm.
in, whether you do it for 4 years, 3 years, or you go that extra mile and you do it in college, you know,
Hmm.
you go through something that is like that initiation that we were
Oh
saying is
yeah.
missing, and it's unfortunate. Some of the things that happen in universities, I don't really like college, but I think that wrestling as a sport is so pivotal for me, and I would
Oh yeah.
encourage anybody to do martial arts, because yeah, wrestling, is more of a thing you do in school. I don't know, I mean, maybe there's wrestling clubs you can go and
Right.
take part in as an adult, but yeah, learn martial arts. It's the same thing. It's just you know wrestling is, yeah, we're a different breed, man. Much respect to you for
Definitely.
that. I'm glad you brought that up.
For sure. A lot of self-discipline, man. Like you learn in that sport and
Mm, yeah,
just knowing you have no teammates to rely on, you're all out there by yourself and you find out a lot about yourself, winning and losing. Like I
right,
learned just as much from the losses, if not more from the wins. And
right.
that taught me a lot just about life because, it's like life throws you punches and how are you going to respond to that, you
Mm.
know?
Yeah, and wrestling was deeply spiritual for me in my last year, because I had started smoking weed like junior year of high school, and I didn't want to, because I was like, oh no, I'm a martial artist, I'm a wrestler, we don't do that, we're sober. But then
Mhm.
I saw Bruce Lee was eating cannabis. He wrote about it in one of his books. I saw Eddie Bravo, who invented all these awesome
Right.
Brazilian jiu-jitsu moves, and he's taking a bong rip in a YouTube video before he goes and kicks ass and teaches all these people these badass moves. So I kind of realized, like, oh, these plants might help me facilitate a state of consciousness that would help me train. And that
Definitely.
was deeply spiritual. Training while under the influence of cannabis was very important for me, I think. And when I would wrestle, I wasn't smoking pot before like the wrestling matches and stuff, because that's like
Right.
a whole like event. I had no time
Right.
to get high before any of my wrestling matches, but I
Your
did
mouth
have
would have been
time.
dry as shit.
Yeah, I did. And the coach would kick your ass. Yeah,
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, but I had this like bone necklace that was like a jawbone from a fox, that
Okay.
I or a wolf or some animal, maybe coyote. I got it at
Mhm.
like, some kitschy, Indian gift store, something like that. But it was very important to me. It signified that animal's spirit, and I would hold that before I wrestled and channel that energy, before I would wrestle. And that was part of it, kind of towards the later last few months of wrestling.
Mhm.
But then that bled into, as I got into martial arts more and more after high school, it became a very spiritual thing for me. And the Sifu that I learned from also smoked weed, and we didn't ever really smoke weed together. It was interesting how, like, we knew each other, we kind of knew that we both smoked weed, but it wasn't until like much later, when I was already, advanced in his class, that we like smoked together. But I think there's something definitely integral to that. Like, it's connected somehow. There's some UFC fighters that allegedly smoke weed, even though they not all of them can. Right? I think some of them can in some leagues, but in the UFC they don't let people have any drugs in their system, at least before the fight. But like
Right.
guys like Nate Diaz, he's a big proponent of cannabis. And John Jones, who I've actually met, I met John Jones once. He smoked weed, obviously got in trouble for it. So I think there's a connection between martial arts, spirituality, and these plant medicines for sure.
Definitely, man. Like, and to be honest, like I smoked with quite a few guys that are now in the NFL, and um, I it always blew my mind because I had this thought that they were all sober, but when you think about it, man, like how much damage their body's taking on a daily basis, like let them smoke a little cannabis to come down and like just like, give their body some, natural remedy of, um, removing pain versus like popping a bunch of painkillers, then getting hooked on those and just going down a really dark cycle. How many guys that overdose on pills because they got hooked on them because of an injury or something. And that's
Mm,
across all sports.
yeah.
But I feel like that's
That
slowly changing.
Yeah, and that's another point of focus for me, and it all ties back to where this all started from me, New Haven, Connecticut. I mean, Yale University, not only are they big historically connected to the drug trade, which brought opioids over to this country in the first place, but some of the biggest, people who go into the pharmacy, industry come from this school and adjacent schools, and they have big hospitals, and there's a big pharmaceutical company right in the center of town. It's one of the biggest buildings in the city. So yeah, that influence is strong there, and it's always upset me deeply because I think
Mhm.
that that is the opposite of sacred, right? It's destroying our connection to what it means to be human being, a human being, and be empowered, this spiritual nature. I think all of those toxins, these chemicals that they're trying to sell to us as medicine, some of them might be helpful. I myself, I broke my wrist and now I have a plate in my wrist. So I'm not, completely against hospitals. I think they do serve a purpose, but I'm totally against pharmaceuticals in every shape or form. They're concentrated down to the point of not being natural anymore. We can get way more value from a living organism. All of those
100%.
things that pharmacies sell, it's just plants chalked up into little powder so they can concentrate it and spread out, you know, the amount that they're wasting, that then make their profit margins larger or make things stronger to the point where it's not natural, like
Mhm.
opium itself, it's not going to do those things that heroin does, or that these
100%.
pharmaceutical pills do. So there's definitely like a discrepancy. The natural world has poisons and toxins in it, but
Right.
those are, that's obvious, like a snake. You can tell what a venomous snake looks like just by seeing the
Right.
colors of it. You can
Mhm.
tell which plants are bad for you if you get the right kind of know-how. And I think that
Right.
there's definitely like something sinister about pharmacy, because the word itself, pharmacopoeia, comes from the word sorcery, and in a lot of these elites that are behind the drug trade and behind these big companies, they're a part of a group of people whose blood, this MR, what is it? Um,
mRNA.
no, that's more recent, but there's a type of blood that certain people have is like 5% of the population. And without pharmaceutical medicine, there was like this issue that they were having. They couldn't reproduce, and it wasn't until they had this pharmaceutical innovation that they were able to RH negative blood is the blood type I'm
Oh,
thinking.
okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And they can't have a healthy child with people who have RH positive blood until this pharmaceutical. So this is just a clue, this is just a suspicion. Don't take this as anything more than that, folks, if you're listening in deeply on this. But that's where my suspicions are leading me. Like there's something about pharmacy and the elite and the
Mhm.
esoteric and the occult that fit together in this way. um, so the mystery's still unraveling for me, but yeah, that's a deep point of interest for me, and it's one of the many things that motivate me as a spiritual warrior, because I think that's what we all are, and that's what martial
Sure.
arts taught me. It's like you have a movement through this universe. You're going to be moving through this universe no matter what. You might as well make it one that's impactful. Be impactful with the way
100%.
you move through the universe.
Yeah. I mean, I think it just boils down to like, as you said before, like nothing is random. Like everything, literally everything happens for a reason. Everyone you meet good or bad. Like you're learning something from that. And it's like I just had this epiphany as you were talking, like I have to think like at one point, in the primitive days, like, when we were hunters and gatherers and we were scavenging for food, it's like we had to be so connected at that point to know, like, deep within, not second guess ourselves, trust our intuition. Like, this plant, we can definitely eat this for dinner tonight. This plant, oh, I know what's happened in the past, poison ivy, what have you. You learn, you live and learn, but it's like there was a lot of trial and error with that. But I just think the height of awareness, as far as like just being in tune with nature, was so much higher. Like, because just like the way we're boxed in, like caged animals into cities these days, like it's just so far removed from the natural world.
Right.
And I just get that concrete jungle feeling,
Right.
as
Yeah,
Bob Marley said.
it's anachronistic architecture, it's not harmonious architecture. I think that's why, and architecture is just one word for it. I think the more complete term is a system through which society and culture have been developed. They've been warped away from the natural. They used to reflect the natural. Cities used to be beautiful. They used to be shaped like a circle, and they used to be shaped so the water would flow through and people would have fresh water running. So there are ways for civilization to be harmonious with nature. We don't have to go back to being wild animals. That's not what it means to be human. Humans are
Mm.
creators. We fashion our environment, and in order to have something that's sustainable, we need to live in harmony symbiotically with the rest of the world. So yeah, I think you're pointing that out very astutely. Like, it's obvious to most people who are awake, like, these cities are not congruent, they're not harmonious, they're not
Yep.
in the real, they're not in the natural. But yeah, man, this has been so much fun, dude. I would definitely want to come back again and get deeper into that, because I'm
Definitely.
still learning a lot of this stuff that we're touching on. And I think you and I can go in like with like a crash course type approach and hit on some of these things in a really productive way.
Most definitely, man. I gotta say, like, it was super synchronistic because, like, after I talked to you about having you on and everything, I had no idea you had, because I remember listening to the Skull and Bones one you did with Sam on Patreon like last year or whatever, and you had mentioned the Kabbalion, or the Kybalion, however you pronounce it.
Yeah.
Um, and I had read that book before I re-listened to that Skull and Bones. I was like, holy shit, like Mark's read this too. And like what pushed me off the edge, because I bought that book. Um, I listened to the Kyle Kingsbury podcast, and he's very tuned in and has worked with a lot of plant medicine, and he's been walking the spiritual path as well. And um, he was like the third person that mentioned that book, across my whole lifetime. And then I had finished that book, and it was in a chapter of that book. I think it was the principle of cause and effect chapter. And it was like totally this description of what my podcast name totally represented. And it was like, it just stuck out to me. Like, it was like, oh, like now I understand why I called this podcast Ascension of the Chess Man. Like, it's right here.
Mm.
And that book is so powerful, man. I definitely know I'll read it again. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that book and how it's impacted your life.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, without rehashing too much of it, because I know I've talked about this so many times, but like the Kybalion was the synchronistic thing that kind of got me where I'm at now in a way, because I read that book so long ago. It meant so much to me. It changed my life so much at a point where I really understood things deeper at that same junction where I was telling you about Terrence McKenna and all these people that were inspiring me. I read that book. And when I had the opportunity of meeting Sam, I gave him that copy, the first copy I ever had, with my notes
Wow.
in it, with my name in it. Cause I was
So
like, I just got to give this to him. Like, I didn't know, I knew I was going to give him a book cause I knew I was going to see him after the show. He was so nice. It seemed that way. Like, oh, everybody
mhm.
come meet me after the show. So I'm like,
Oh yeah,
perfect. I'll give
he's
him
a
this
great guy.
book. Maybe he'll talk about it on his show, cause I wanted him to get into these kind of spiritual ideas. Cause I've listened to every episode up to that point, and I knew kind of where his mind was at with the um, eagle versus a serpent, Matt LaCroix stuff, and like so they had
Mhm.
talked about some of this stuff already. But I was like, he needs to have this book, and it's such a small book. I was like, even though he's super busy, he could read this
Right.
book. So I
Yeah, it's a
picked
quick
that.
read.
Yeah, so I picked that book out of all the books I had, even though it meant so much to me. I almost didn't want to part with it because it had that
Mhm.
sentimental value. So I gave it to him. I gave it to him in this like Faraday fabric. And I told him about the Faraday fabric, like, oh, this is what it does,
Oh yeah, yeah.
blocks EMF radiation, put your phone in it, and it's pretty much, isolated. The world doesn't know where it is. So he was like,
Mhm.
whoa, this is crazy. Thank you so much. I don't know if you ever read the book, but one thing led to another. And just like you signed up for my Patreon and we started talking. I signed up for his Patreon and he was doing a live stream. And I was like, hey, I gave you that book and the fabric. Did you read the book? And he was like, oh, you got to be on the Patreon to tell me about the fabric. So I was like, okay, cool. But, when it happened, I'm like, let's talk about Skull and Bones.
Right.
So, and that was, one thing led to another. He had me back on multiple times. And then
Oh yeah.
when the Zero show happened, he had me on as a guest, third episode. And I
Oh
was
yeah.
like, oh, well, who are you going to have on next? Maybe you should have this guy, this guy, this guy. And he was so impressed by the amount of people I was about to refer to be on his show. He was like, well, why don't you just, do this and I'll pay you, $20 a guest. And it all started from there. And now I get a weekly salary from him
Lit,
to
bro.
do the booking. But that's my point, is like that book, as meaningful as it was to me, I gave it away to him with that
Mhm.
hope that like he would read it and it would inspire him. And like, sure enough, like, dude, months later, he has this awesome podcast, Zero
Mhm.
Spirituality, and I'm working on it. You know what I mean? So that's the
Super
magic of the
synchronistic,
world
bro.
we're living in. If you just really believe that it's true, and it is true. So don't
Oh yeah.
believe, no, have the knowledge and take part, to be an active participant in this process of co-creation. And that's not to, again, be on some high horse like, oh, look at me, I work for a celebrity, or fuck that, dude. Me and Sam are real, and honestly, I barely talk to him. I do my job, and when he has the opportunity, I talk to him, and that's really cool. But for the most part, it's a professional thing, and I'm really grateful
Right.
for the opportunity. And it's like Jason Burmis said on my podcast, it's like, you don't just get these opportunities falling in your lap. You prepare yourself
100%.
deeply, and then that right moment comes. So all of the training, all of the schooling I did for myself when I was like, fuck college, I'm going to learn about this stuff for myself. I didn't know it was going to line up to be, working for Tinfoil Hat, but it did. And I loved that show. I dedicated a lot of time to listening to it, as well as the Higher Side Chats and the Grimerica show. And Graham's been on my podcast. I talked to Graham a bunch for the, just about a bunch of stuff. And with my cooperative that I started, I'm pretty sure I invited you in. We got to make you a page for it, for your
Oh,
podcast on
definitely.
my
Yeah.
cooperative. But yeah, that's what this has all become, is like, it's so much more than just, oh, now I work for Tinfoil Hat. It's like, no, like, I'm getting involved in this movement. And like we said at the beginning, this is a golden age of podcasting.
Oh yeah. I completely agree, man. And like, I mean, it's just like Crow 777 always says, belief is the enemy of knowing. And it's like once you know and have faith that it's all gonna work out, there's no room for false beliefs and like insecurities and you know, oh, I don't know, like that scarcity versus abundance stuff. It's like
Mm,
just trust the process, trusting that it'll all work out for your benefit. You just got to put one foot in front of the other and, keep chipping away at yourself and what you're trying to learn and, trying to grow into. and like
Mm.
never look back. Like, oh, I was that person, 20 days ago, and just surrendering to the process, like, and trusting that it'll all work out. And I think you embody that completely. And how you brought that book to Sam, and then it turns into zero, and then the podcast episode you do on zero is synchronicity. Like, it's all synchronicity, bro. Like,
Yeah,
when
what
it
else would
boils
I
down
talk
to it,
about? And it's
right?
funny because I mean, I don't know if I've ever really even talked to Sam about that in that way, but every time
Right,
I
right,
see him, I've seen him a couple times, when he goes in reach, I can drive like 12 hours without
right.
sleeping. So I drove to see him in Indianapolis when he was out in Indianapolis, and I gave him some
Oh,
books
yeah.
then. But yeah, it's such a cool thing. And the other cool thing is like the Illuminati card game. I found that in Indianapolis, and then I gave it to him. So for those who
Wow.
like tinfoil hat, here's a little heads up. Like in a couple weeks, they're going to be doing an episode about that. So stay tuned.
Oh,
Interesting
yeah.
stuff. But like that game was super rare. Found it at this used bookstore for like $300. And I was like, hey Sam, send me $300. Let's buy this. And then when he came into town, I gave it to him. So
That's
yeah,
awesome, man.
synchronicity, man. It all, like, you just open yourself up. And everybody, this is something I learned from Michael Wan, is like everybody has a mystery to solve, like whether it connects to your name, your family, who you are, where you came from, where you live, the place, why you had that one thing happen to you in your life. Everybody's got that one thing. Today something came back into focus for me. I remember when I was a kid, this person, I don't remember their name, but I saw like flames like when I was at their house, and it was like a weird experience that I never forgot, and it just came back into focus today. And I'm like, I wonder what that was. Like, was it just like an active imagination, or was there like some kind of like vision of fire there? And it just things connect, and in a personal way that there's no need to go into, but that's just one example of like the things that can be waiting if you just open your open your eyes to the mystery that is life.
Oh, yeah. It's a beautiful trip, man. Life is a beautiful trip. And I just want to thank you so much for coming on, brother. And I'm sure we'll do this again in the near
Yes.
future. And
Yes.
thank you for, just all the wisdom you've shared tonight. And I know the listeners are going to love this. And I guess, if you could just tell the listeners where they can find you and what you're up to.
Yeah, well, every week we do the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, where I interview folks that I deem interesting. So you're going to be there. I definitely want to have you on my show as a
Appreciate that.
guest. And the really interesting thing that bleeds into all of what we're talking about today is the synchro-mystic experiment in the ever expanding now. And right now you can only find that on my Patreon. So if you're interested in learning about these synchronicities and getting this part going, that's where it's going to happen. And Andre, you're part of it, so I'm really happy that you're there. And yeah, I mean, please, folks, check out the show. I mean, see what you think, and follow us on Instagram. My Family Thinks I'm Crazy on Instagram, all one word. And then myfamilythinksimcrazy.com is the website, and you can find the Patreon through there.
Love you, brother. Love you all.
Likewise.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you, man.
Um, so have a great week, guys. And I love you all. Beautiful.
Likewise. Thanks for having me, man.
It's my pleasure.